Haas, the Director of Teacher Programming with the Paleontological Research Institution, and the host for tonight's program. Our special guest tonight is James Damico, who is the author of How to Confront Climate Denial, Literacy, Social Studies, and Climate Change. And he is a grad school friend from way back when. We've known each other for more than 25 years, I think, thereabouts, which is a little mind warping. We're out of touch for a long stretch of time, and then I learned he was doing climate change education too, and doing some really important work. And apologies for not having my permissions set right on the Google Doc. I will change that immediately. So it should work now. And I'm going to hand it off to James. So take it away, James.
Well, thank you, Don, for the invitation to connect with you today. And thank you, everyone, for finding time to be here. I know it can be a hectic time as we march or crawl our way to a break in the school or academic calendar during a holiday season. So I will share my screen here. Attempt to do so. Let's see here. Is it shared? It's telling me that I need to change some preferences here, so I apologize. Not sure here why that's the case. Let's see. Change the settings. And unlock that.
I will note, as James is fixing his settings, that we have another program on Thursday night, or we are part of another program that is actually run by WSKG, which is the Binghamton NPR station. And we will be talking about, there we go, we will be talking about Cornell's Deep Geothermal Heat Project, which has potential to change the energy system and change the way we heat buildings. So that info is down in the coming events part of the Google Doc that I just shared, but now I'm going to hand it off to James.
Okay, sorry about that glitch there. So I want to start with a few screenshots about the Nile River. And you might know where I'm heading with this. And that is, the Nile is not just a river in Egypt, as the saying goes. It is experiencing consequences of climate change denial. And working with climate denial is the focus today. So in this session, I want to first briefly chart my journey as a climate justice educator. And I'll clarify a few points to ground what is to follow. And that is exploring one approach to teaching and learning about climate change. And that's emphasizing the investigation of climate denial. That's teachers and students forging identities as climate denial detectives. And working with texts or artifacts, context, stories, and ecological philosophies or ecosophies is fundamental to climate denial detective work. And all of this work for me and my colleague, Mark Bailden, who's the co-author of this book, is deeply rooted in inquiry. Students and teachers posing and pursuing questions that matter. So I'll offer some inquiry pathways that aim to confront climate denial and promote ecological justice. I'll also outline ways of thinking about advancing climate justice with teachers and students forging identities as climate justice delegates. Okay, so just a few highlights of my journey as a climate justice educator. It begins when I was a middle school teacher in the 1990s in New Jersey. And what I want to highlight about this experience is that I taught about environmental issues and social justice as distinct. I taught about environmental issues at that time, recycling, wildlife preservation, in science, for example, animal rights. Then I taught about racism, gender inequities, and indigenous perspectives in other subjects, primarily language arts, through children's and young adult literature. And I wrote this recent article, Then and Now, Time for Eco-Justice Literacies, as a way to reflect on that experience and how I no longer see them as distinct, and how it's important, at least from my perspective, not to see environmental issues and issues related to racial, economic, gender justice as separate. And for the past 18 years, I've been a professor of literacy, culture, and language education in the School of Education at Indiana University. And my work has really been animated by concerns about complex, multifaceted topics or problems, ranging from thinking about globalization, healthcare, 9/11 conspiracy theories, and a lot about climate change since 2008, when I started teaching about it in my courses here. And a lot of my scholarship over the past 14 or 15 years has examined how, in particular, how future teachers think about climate change and climate denial as they engage with different kinds of websites about climate change. A really key framing ideas is thinking about, again, climate change as a mega problem. And if we look at all of these problems that James Martin lays out, each is exacerbated by global warming. Also inspired, continue to be by Desmond Tutu, who had this really powerful quote for me 12 years ago about the lack of climate change education in K through 12 schools as well as universities. And there's a really need to understand climate change as a global social justice issue. Just a few understandings that I bring to this work. Don pointed to this at the beginning of our session. The first key point is that I think it's important to think about climate change and climate denial as industry-led. These are large fossil fuel companies, primarily responsible for global temperature rise, aided and abetted by public relations companies, law firms, and financial institutions. So calling climate change human-caused or anthropogenic is somewhat misleading. A second key point is that an emphasis on climate denial and climate change, but climate denial in particular, is inherently multi or transdisciplinary. We'll explore this further as we proceed. And the third key point is that climate change causes and consequences are fundamentally about justice. We'll also explore that further as we proceed. As a basic starting point, communities and countries least responsible for climate change have been the most affected. So to make the teaching of climate denial and climate justice more palatable and possible for different groups of educators and administrators and even parents, I've returned to basic assumptions that continue to strike me as true for myself and the hundreds of teachers I've had an opportunity to work with and learn from. And that is that teachers primarily care about two things. They care about students and they care about the state of the world. So in caring for students, teachers want to understand who students are, what's in their hearts and in their minds, and make every effort to help them reach their potential as learners and as human beings. In caring about the state of the world, teachers want to make a difference in helping shape a world that's more fair, equitable, and just, a world in which current and future generations of students can thrive. So that's why I think classrooms are an ideal place to address perhaps the most far-reaching and consequential challenge of our times, which is global climate change. So in terms of caring about students, we know that children and young people in the United States and around the world are increasingly concerned about the impact of global temperature rise and what this means for them now and into the future. Climate change is on many of their minds, and they want to do something about it. In caring about the state of the world, we continue to witness, the escalating impact of climate change across communities, countries, and continents. In the United States, the EPA emphasizes there's no city, community, or small town that's not being affected by climate change. So how might we go about teaching this? What might this look like in our classroom? So Again, I want to propose that students and teachers can work together in these two ways, as detectives of climate denial and as delegates of climate justice. So let's first consider what it could mean to be a climate denial detective. And again, we'll have an inquiry perspective to guide us with a question like, how did we get here? Or why are we now wrestling with climate-related challenges or crises? So we know that detectives investigate, they address corruption, violations of the law, assorted crimes. They attempt to discern the truth about what happened, the causes of things. They weigh different forms of evidence. They use reasoning to make decisions, draw conclusions. We know that evidence-based reasoning is the lifeblood of inquiry-based teaching and learning in any academic discipline, right, or subject matter area. And young people tend to be natural truth seekers. They have less patience and tolerance for deceit, deception, and lies. They seem to wield truth antenna. They have this knack for instinctively detecting even subtle shades of deception. So as climate denial detectives, teachers and students, like in social studies classrooms, for example, can launch a historical whodunit investigation to uncover all the ways large fossil fuel companies for decades have engaged in this campaign of deceit and deception and disinformation to manufacture doubt and confusion about climate science and to derail climate policy action. So, and to support this work, the Center for Climate Integrity, for example, has this treasure trove of primary documents across 5 decades that captures and catalogs climate denial and what it called its library, these LIE. The investigative journalists over at DSMOG also have a database to mine. Toxic Docs website offers other resources. All of these provide teachers and students opportunities to you can dive into these primary source documents and artifacts, along with other accessible resources to conduct a range of inquiry investigations. And as climate denial detectives, it's also important to identify how these fossil fuel companies, again, did not act alone. They were part of a network of industry-led organizations, foundations, and associations that function as this climate denial machine. Many of you probably are familiar with that work that's been done. It's over a decade old now to kind of trace the influence of these different, of this network and how it's operated. Other climate denial accomplices include these public relations companies, law firms, financial institutions, again, that have been working at the behest of big coal, oil, and gas corporations, right? And the denial is ongoing, right? These techniques and tactics persist into the present, whether it's greenwashing, redirecting climate responsibility from corporations to individual consumers, promoting renewable energy as unreliable, suggesting that electric vehicles are inadequate. These are all attempts to deny, deceive, and delay the necessary action on global climate change. So for example, calling climate activists hypocrites or elitists for traveling on an airplane, or this idea of absolutionism, where one country would absolve itself from taking climate action by highlighting the perceived failings of another state, another country, or group. And it's important to note that these tactics are increasingly linked to free market ideologies and identity and cultural politics, whether it's about electoral integrity, public health, and vaccines, or any extension of government power, including climate action, is perceived as a threat to individual liberties. So I want to now share a model to promote the work of climate denial detectives. And in this model, I've worked with, again, my colleague, Mark Belden, along with Alex Panos on this instructional model. And it highlights the work that climate denial detectives can do. This includes being able to identify and analyze a climate denial text. That's at the heart of this model. Also to investigate stories that we live by. These are these dominant narratives or myths, or assumptions that we tacitly accept, and often we're not fully aware that they're operating as stories. Of particular interest are stories that promote climate denial, stories like humans are the center of existence, separate from nature, and that nature is primarily a resource to be used by humans. Also, these zero-sum stories related to individualism, idea that if someone else benefits, then I'm losing. This really wonderful argument that Heather McGee lays out in her recent book, The Sum of Us. It's a careful examination of this zero-sum ideology or story. And because stories shape how we understand and act in the world, we also place them at the center of the model alongside the denial texts. As part of being a climate denial detective, considering these contexts of climate denial, which align with academic disciplines and subject matter areas in school, which I'll talk a little bit about in just a moment or two, and to examine our ecological philosophies. Right? This is the reflective practice in which students, teachers, and people more generally would consider their own views about their environment and their relationship to it. And that's an ongoing reflection. So we depict these denial contexts and ecosophies as part of a swirling mix that's shaping how we read and evaluate denial texts. And as the two triangles in the north and south of this image indicate, there are two sets of frameworks, the tools and resources that we can use to engage with texts and stories and contexts and ecosophies. And that's critical literacies, which are ways of reading, and what we call eco-civic practices. These are ways of communicating, dialogue, and discussion across differences with an ecological lens. I'm going to focus less on these eco-civic practices right now, but happy to discuss them further if people would like to do that. So again, what's most important is these critical literacies and eco-civic practices help learners engage with these texts, stories, contexts, and ecosophies. And all of this work moves us to better understand eco-justice stories to live by. I'll talk a little bit more about those. So also of note, when using this model, it's possible to focus on just one or more of these dimensions. But it's most powerful when viewed in the aggregate as a unified set of instructional goals. At least that's my view and experience. So I just want to say a little bit more about each of these components. So the first is to identify climate change denial. And we make a distinction in the book between climate science denial and climate action denial. So climate science denial is just a straight up rejection of the scientific consensus about global warming. And if we are able to identify science denial, then pretty straightforward practice, critical literacy in terms of ways of reading, would be to identify these denial techniques. And some of you may be familiar with the Flick framework that has been led by John Cook, where learners, teachers and students can ask questions about, if it's science denial, then most likely one or more of these are in operation. So these are fake experts, there's logical fallacies in their arguments, impossible expectations, there's cherry picking or conspiracy theories. And again, John Cook digs more deeply into each of these as examples. If it's climate action denial, this is where the text might accept the climate science and say, yeah, global warming is happening, but it dismisses or it minimizes the implications of that science. And thus it impedes the necessary actions to address the crisis. So in terms of criteria that we lay out for determining climate action denial, this is what a text or an artifact or an information source suggests that industries or nations can't decarbonize on time or in alignment with the IPCC goals, or suggests other priorities are more important or need to be balanced with any of these climate goals, or provides a misleading impression that the particular group or company or institution is meeting those goals. And we see that third one quite frequently when we're looking across, especially fossil fuel companies' greenwashing efforts. Okay, so when it's climate action denial, the step is, okay, we still need to ask questions and think about the ways of reading those particular texts. But rather than the Flick model, which is focusing on the science, there are other lenses or tools and questions we can use. And the work of Lamb and colleagues and Supran and Areskes and colleagues have also been really influential in helping us think about, okay, so when we see this action denial, what discourse of delay is operating? How are they redirecting responsibility? Are they advocating for non-transformative solutions? Are they surrendering to the problem, emphasizing the downsides? A lot of technological optimism. We can figure it out in the future. Someone will come in and rescue us with this wonderful new innovation or invention 10 years from now. Fossil fuel solutionism, fossil fuels need to be part of the solution moving forward, and so forth. And greenwashing is a big one too. So this is a visual, it's hard to see perhaps, but again, it references Lamb and colleagues' work in terms of seeing that all laid out. Okay. Also, these stories, right? So we identify these texts as science or action denial. Then we can start thinking about, well, what stories are circulating in these texts, and this idea of stories we live by being particularly useful. And one straightforward approach to analyzing these broader cultural narratives or myths that we tacitly accept is to determine the extent to which they promote or accept ecological harm or health and well-being. So, for example, these stories that are more destructive with an ecological lens, again, humans are center of existence, separate from nature. Economic growth without limits is a primary goal we have in society. Nature is a resource to be used for human purposes. When we trace out those stories and think them through, they clearly have destructive implications for ecological health, well-being, and balance. In contrast, we can promote stories that are more beneficial, stories like that advocate the respect and care and responsibility for all populations, all species, human, ecological, and planetary well-being with the recognition of limits and civic engagement for the common good. All of these are supportive of ecological health and well-being. Okay, so the last key piece here, I want to talk about our context of denial in the model. This is where the multidisciplinary intent of this instructional model is most evident. So climate denial texts are produced in and shaped by different contexts. Each context provides potential insight into the ways climate denial works in a particular text or artifact. Each of these contexts point to some curricular possibilities, which I'd like to consider next. But we can understand climate denial with the economic lens, the political lens, cultural, historical. We think about sociological and motivated reasoning and how we align ourselves in tribes and the diverse impacts of climate change around the world, as well as how media contexts in the United States and abroad promote misinformation and disinformation about climate change. All of these are curricular possibilities. So to highlight a few of these pathways, here are just some sets of questions that align with core academic disciplines or subject areas in social studies. Some of these questions cut across the disciplines. They don't fit neatly into any one subject area, and by no means is this an exhaustive list. The goal is just to provide a way into climate denial. I'm also going to highlight several inquiry questions that have been particularly generative with students that I've used. So economics questions, thinking about systems and to what extent current or even idealized versions of economic models might be most useful for us moving forward. Think about neoliberalism, prosperity without growth, kind of generative concepts and terms that need to be unpacked and explored, and with questions. This is perhaps the question that's been most, I've used the most, what best explains the range of climate change beliefs in the United States, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence. and consensus about the existence and causes of human-caused climate change. So I could talk more about that in the discussion, but that's been the most powerful one that we've used in my experience. Another question that's been really generative is, was the climate crisis avoidable? They go back and look at those documents in the 80s and 90s, and they wrestle with, well, what did we know at that particular time? To what extent could this have been avoided and averted? And you can answer that question yes or no, and still dive deeply into the material, which is the goal. The sociology and psychology offer really important questions about how we are processing and understanding. And this last question about language that's come up more recently with students. How do we think about and navigate the landscape of climate change emotionally and psychologically, and what might be most useful and how we talk about that? Questions about the media. These policy-driven questions tend to be generative for students. Questions about, what ways should social media be regulated when it comes to climate misinformation? And should media companies accept fossil fuel advertising dollars? Some geography questions. This last one has been generative, where students get a chance to think about climate denial in their own lives, their families, and their communities. And across all of these, these disciplines, I'm a big believer in the arts, and both offering us tools and artifacts and just ways of thinking that are particularly generative when it comes to thinking about climate change and climate change denial. Okay, that was a quick run through those. We can go back and talk through any more of those questions if that would be useful. And as we head to the finish line here in this presentation, I want to emphasize again these two key ideas. Given that teachers care about students and about the state of the world, they can work alongside students as detectives of climate denial and as delegates of climate justice, with inquiry as essential to this. So I want to explore this idea of teachers and students as delegates of climate justice. And again, we'll have this inquiry-based approach. We'll pose a question, where do we go from here? So delegates, they serve in the interests of others. They often participate in wider conversations and different kinds of official settings, as representatives to advance the interests of their particular group. And we can start by defining justice as the quality of being fair, reasonable and equitable. So one essential step to being a climate justice delegate is to become more informed about the ways climate change can magnify and compound existing injustices. For example, we know that a greater occurrence or intensity of heat waves, droughts, fires, and floods is exacerbating problems of food and water scarcity, habitat and biodiversity loss, and the forced migration of climate refugees, in ways that disproportionately impact our most vulnerable populations, in communities and countries who have been least responsible for climate change effects. So we need to understand how climate-related challenges intersect with various forms of gender, racial, socioeconomic, and spatial or geographic injustices, within the United States and throughout the world. And as delegates of climate justice, we also need to become more informed about the range of justice-focused proposals and projects already underway to help prevent or mitigate severe climate effects and work towards these different visions and versions of where we can go from here. And this includes shining a light on the inspiring climate justice efforts around the world, in particular, the ways youth are working to imagine and create more equitable and just futures, and equipped with deeper understandings about climate change solutions. A next step is for teachers and students as delegates of climate justice is to participate in wider conversations and policy discussions in our own schools and communities, as well as across county, state, regional, national, and or international settings, as representatives who were there to advance the interests of climate justice. So this can include advocating at local school board meetings for the teaching and learning of climate change and climate justice across subject areas and grade levels, participating in town council meetings to propose and deliberate local actions to address the climate crisis, attending educational conferences to help hold professional organizations, its leaders and members accountable for timely, decisive action to combat climate denial and advance climate justice, and even participating in these large-scale environmental events, like the recent UN climate summit in Egypt, the COP27. So these are just a few possibilities for the way students and teachers can serve as delegates of climate justice. So I want to kind of stop there. And again, just to wrap up, if teachers care about students and about the state of the world, then teaching about climate change and climate justice can become an instructional priority. And one way of thinking about this that teachers might find useful is working with and learning from students as climate denial detectives and as delegates of climate justice. And using an inquiry-based instructional model is essential to support this work. So I'll stop there. I also have a couple of examples. I can kind of share through a couple short videos to kind of go through a couple of different denial texts. But I wanted to stop here, Don, and to kind of see where we are. And there might be questions that could take us where we need to go to. So
sounds good. So are there questions? Let's pause. And I know I was emailed a question by one of you that I think warrants a little more talking about. And it's become the most common question that I've been asked, or the most common topic that I'm asked about, and that's how do you teach about climate change without generating anxiety? And I have thoughts on that, but I'm curious to hear yours.
Well, I guess it depends on what age group you're considering. I mean, the approach for me would vary considerably based on the age, of the students or participants in a setting. I do think that there are some ways of helping students orient to climate change. I find one recent kind of acronym useful, and that is keep it simple, serious, and solvable. And if you can, simple in terms of what the problem is, it is a serious problem, but most importantly, it's solvable. And that there are already people working on that solution. So the extent to which you dive deeply into the climate change effects and the concerns and the forecasts, I think that's where I would adopt the simple approach and saying, here's what we know about what the challenges are, and that they're solvable. So I don't know if we're going to talk about a specific example more, Don, but I think that's this communication, the emphasis on the solutions, and that people are already doing this work, and that there's a lot of debate and discussion about what's the best way to move forward. And I think seeing students, and what doesn't matter what age they are, as participants in this conversation. So in order to participate in a conversation about what are the best or ideal ways forward, we need to equip ourselves with what are the solutions, and we just need to spend some time investigating that. We have to shore up our own understandings, and as a way of moving forward.
Great. Yeah, and Lori revealed herself as the question asker, and she's a fifth grade teacher. And I'll just note that I think not being honest about the state of things generates more anxiety rather than reduces it. If you pretend all is rosy, kids will see through that. So I think that's an important idea. And there are a couple more questions in the chat. Karen asked, I'd love to see some concrete examples of putting this into practice, and that she loves the idea of detectives. So you want to talk a little bit about, or maybe show if you've got relevant video or other content relating to showing some concrete examples, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I think I need to share my screen again. Quickly go through an example. Let's see here. There we go. Okay. Again, if we're thinking about climate denial text, that's the first step. Here's an example you might be familiar with. This is an example of a climate science denial. I think it's worth watching here.
What the left gets wrong about climate change are, first of all, very numerous examples, but the first and most important one is this idea that all scientists agree, that there's a 97% climate consensus, that no one disagrees in the scientific community. And this is perhaps the most outrageous falsehood of all. If you go back 25 years, Al Gore was promoting the same claim that all scientists agreed before we even had a climate debate. And what happens is once you start looking at the 97% claims, you find out that they're quite literally pulled from thin air, in the words of one of the top United Nations scientists, Dr. Richard Toll, or we find out that they're not even 97 scientists. One of the surveys was only 77 scientists, and they were anonymous scientists. And this is how they create a myth. It's a talking point designed so you don't have to think. All scientists agree. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this toothpaste. Why wouldn't I buy that toothpaste? Why wouldn't I believe in climate change? The other myth is that we're in the unprecedented hottest year, hottest decade. The earth is at a boiling point. These hottest year claims are merely political statements, that they're within the margin of error between hottest year statements. And then the most outrageous myth of all is that carbon dioxide is somehow the control knob of the climate. I point out in the book with Ivy League geologists, Nobel Prize winning scientists, that we've had ice ages with higher CO2 levels. The CO2 is not in any way, shape, or form controlling the climate, that there were quite literally hundreds of factors, from ocean cycles, the tilt of the Earth's axis, the clouds, water vapor, volcanoes, and solar cycles, that they do not control. CO2 alone does not control the climate. It is one of these factors that get essentially drowned out, and you can't distinguish its effect from natural variability.
Okay, so this is a Facebook video, over 10 million views. It's a pretty straightforward example of climate science denial. It's a rejection of the science. And that means we can go to our Flick questions and see if we can identify, well, if it's science denial, one of these or more of these are probably occurring in the text. And when we do that, we can see that there's fake experts. Richard Toll is not a scientist. He's an economist. He's clearly not a climate scientist of that particular claim. There's logical fallacies, oversimplification and misrepresentation about climate scientists are arguing that CO2 alone controls the climate. That's not what scientists are saying. There's cherry picking clearly with claims about, there's not even 97 scientists. Ignores the more comprehensive and extensive findings, and even like this incipient or emerging kind of conspiracy theory suggesting that Democrats are only making political statements and perpetuating these climate myths. So here's another quick example that is not climate science denial. It's about climate action denial. And there are literally dozens and dozens of these. Let's see if we can get it to go here. Yeah, there we go. This is a YouTube video from the Shell oil company. Yeah, and this ending little disclaimer here is really important. It's hard to see here. But they're basically saying, well, we're not going to do what we need to do unless we have to do it, or we're really our customers demand it, and so forth, which is a clever delay technique. Okay, so if this is a climate action denial, right, there's nothing in here that says climate change is not happening, but are they taking the necessary actions to address the crisis? So here's where these questions about, what discourses of delay or denial frames are evident. And there might be more in here, but there's some evidence of them pushing non-transformative solutions, focusing on existing new technologies. There's one line in there about redirecting responsibility to individuals who are ultimately responsible in their choices. The fossil fuel solutionism as a frame, even a fossil fuel savior frame is what Supran and Oreskes lay out. And this is clearly greenwashing in terms of their strategy to portray this ecologically responsible image. And again, going back to the model, again, those are the discourses. Looking at this particular model of texts and stories and context and ecosophies, we can look at the context of these two texts, videos, the Facebook video, this free market anti-regulatory approach to environmental issues. It's all the funding they've received from Donors Trust, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Heartland, all part of that, the group that put together that video. The Facebook platform itself has spread just a staggering amount of climate misinformation over the years. And you clearly see how the techniques in that video were targeting motivated reasoning of viewers, particular affiliations with a tribe, as part of the context for that video. In the Shell oil video, we have economic context, thinking about fossil fuel capitalism, growth and prosperity, political influences linked toward that. And again, it's a social media platform, and all the ways music and other techniques are used to convince us or to sway us. And again, there are these stories we live by that we can kind of talk through a little bit more. Which ones do we see, or other related stories in these videos, these two texts, as potential inquiry questions? And we can look at the climate denial machine and so forth. So, and, I'm talking to a group of mostly folks with a lot more scientific expertise than I have about climate change and about any other range of topics. And one of the things I've found, or I continue to grapple with engaging with climate change and climate change denial, is to what extent students need to have deep understandings about climate science in order to kind of reckon with these texts. And that's an ongoing question. I would appreciate your comments and thoughts about that as a group. I've approached this from the very beginning as I'm not teaching climate science. I'm not teaching climate change as a scientific issue. I'm teaching it as a social scientific issue. And as a starting point, I can bring in all these other perspectives. And often I have to go back and check with colleagues or do my own research about the scientific related claims. That's where I think the climate science denial, what's really being denied here. That's why the FLIC framework it's been so useful to just apply when we seek science denial. Let's try to understand, okay, that cues me into, okay, what expert is being drawn upon to make a claim here? And then I can go to that expert and say, okay, Richard Toll, I can do some quick research on Richard Toll, and he's not a climate scientist. Okay, I can see fake expert. So those questions help me think scientifically. And I think that's been a key insight along the way with that particular framework. The second part, this climate action denial, it's more unwieldy. It's almost everywhere to a certain extent. I've had students say, what's not climate action denial? Like most of the stuff we're doing in the world is most of our actions each day are not, helping directly reduce our carbon footprints and so forth, and taking the necessary kind of systemic outlook and changes. So That is also an ongoing question, and to think about climate action denial. We try to appeal to the IPCC guidelines, helps us think critically about all a range of solutions that are being offered now, and kind of working through those. And again, I didn't talk a lot about the eco-civic practices, but that's really essential to this too. And we do get into that in the book in terms of we need people talking with each other across different perspectives, grounded in texts, using frameworks. And we've had some real success when we've done that. It doesn't always work. Sometimes it doesn't, but when it does, it's quite meaningful, especially when students are able to convince each other or other students about, did you know that that text is supported by the Heartland Institute, and that institute has also been involved in these other efforts. And that can convince a bunch of students who didn't see that the first time they looked at that source, because these techniques and tactics are they're quite compelling, and sometimes they're just hard to see. So that the opportunity for dialogue is really essential.
Yeah, and I'll note there's some interesting vignettes in the book, and set in your social studies methods classroom. I assume that's where it is, with working with future teachers and working through some of these things that I do recommend reading. And Karen asks some follow-up questions that I think you mostly answered. Did Karen, did he get all of your follow-ups there? You can unmute yourself if you'd like.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
I really love the idea of climate detectives, and I'm wondering whether you actually show, say, middle school or high school students your slides that have the things to probe further on to the students, or how you actually engage the students in questioning the validity of the incredible videos that you showed us. What's your next step with students?
Yeah, I think I've tried different things, Karen, and different approaches in terms of just showing a video first. Because it's only a 2-minute video, we can watch it several times. Sometimes I'll just show the video and like, what do you notice about this? And what are the claims? What evidence is being used? Sometimes we do that. Sometimes I say, okay, we're going to use this framework and give them teach them about Flick, have them apply that framework with a couple other examples. And again, there's no shortage of examples. I'm a pretty strong proponent of kind of repetition in that sense. Let's try this framework. Let's get familiar with it. FLICC. They become familiar with those terms, and then they can start applying them to different science denial. It's not just a climate denial. There's other kinds of science denial too that that framework is appropriate for. So lots of short examples, 2-minute clips, 1-minute clips, a short little excerpt, a tweet even, that's only 200 characters or whatever it is, and starting to see if we can identify those techniques. It's all about identifying techniques. And the more we can do that, the better. The trickiest one for me tends to be the logical fallacies, because I don't have the deeper scientific knowledge. So that's where I need to do my own research and prepare when I'm using text. But I also feel comfortable, students, we can, college students, we'll spend a few minutes and say, okay, let's go see if you can go find a climate denial text out there, and share it with a partner in class, or we'll project it, and we'll just have a quick conversation about what we notice. In that situation, the techniques that tend to be most prevalent are cherry picking and fake experts, and conspiracy theories are also pretty easy to identify. Sometimes they're a bit pernicious, but we can tend to identify it. So typically, the repetition is important, and practicing it, not just doing it once, but practicing it until they become really familiar with it. I found to be the best approach for me.
So it's really directed inquiry built around those, what do you call them, frameworks?
Right.
Got it.
Now,
Thank you.
yeah, so when we're looking at specific text, kind of building our skills, Karen, I think that's what's been most useful. So, okay, now I know how to use this. But I also want to, go back to those kind of inquiry pathways that I briefly kind of move through quickly, because those are the larger questions that I really want students to investigate. These are questions about, was the climate crisis avoidable? Where they have to look at a range of different artifacts to think that through. And the question of what best explains why there's a range of beliefs about climate change despite the scientific consensus, that kind of question really has them think about, okay, what's the best explanation for why there's this range of beliefs? They think about historical explanations, they think about economic explanations, psychological explanations. So it's a kind of question that requires them to investigate a lot of different sources and kind of think through a range of different ways of understanding and answering that question. So that's not a specific, that's different than this kind of just text analysis techniques, that kind of directed inquiry approach. And I think they need to be in tandem, finding ways to do it. That directed inquiry can be, it can only take like 5 or 10 minutes to do one of those, once a week, once a day, whatever. And then those inquiry questions take longer to investigate, but they can be well worth the time.
Yeah, and
Great, thank you.
one of the things I like best about the book is there are just scores of really rich inquiry questions to guide instruction. And I think those of you who are familiar with the Ambitious Science Teaching Project, which I know Amy is, for one, but I think it resonates really well with that work. If you look at that book and you look at the nature of discussions in the Ambitious Science Teaching Project, then you can do some good stuff. Let's see, Cindy had a question. Do you have any examples of how climate detectives has been incorporated into history courses?
In history courses outside of the School of Education or outside of social studies methods courses, no, I'm not directly familiar with how that's worked. I know that the environmental humanities is becoming more popular in universities, at least. If your question is focused on the university settings, in terms of history more generally, I'm not directly familiar with those examples. I do think in our social studies, in School of Education, some of these inquiry pathways are definitely historical questions we've asked them, in terms of thinking about the climate crisis being avoidable or not, or trying to understand the legacies of colonialism and what's the relationship of colonialism and climate denial as a generative question that requires historical lenses, tools, and resources and frameworks to investigate.
Other questions? Comments? My notes and see if there were anything. And we are at an hour, so we could wrap it up fairly soon. But I think folks would be interested to hear a little bit more of the sort of contrast of the vignette with the two teacher candidates and how they.
I can't hear.
I think folks might be interested in hearing a little bit about the vignettes of the two teacher candidates and how they kind of wrestle with some of these ideas.
Okay, I lost my audio for a second there, Don. I'm sorry. Just got it back.
Oh, okay.
I know what you said. My apologies.
That's all right. That's all right. So the vignettes that sort of describe the interaction between two teacher candidates, I forget what chapter that's in, but I thought that was an engaging and interesting read on sort of different pedagogical approaches of a couple of different teacher candidates, and maybe you could just say a little bit about that story.
Yeah, and this kind of speaks to the question you asked too, Karen. Partly this is just different kind of pedagogical strategies in the classroom. I've done a lot of work where a lot of my teaching is focused on just providing students websites that have competing perspectives about climate change, different arguments, polar opposite arguments. And I ask them questions about those two websites and directly ask them, which of these sites is more credible or reliable and why. And what sometimes happens is that they'll look at two websites, one from the Heartland Institute that's promoting climate denial, and the IPCC website, and they'll look at both of those sites and they'll say, well, they're both reliable, they're both credible. And sometimes their explanation is due to the need to have both sides represented on an issue, right? That tends to be the common response, and it's not surprising, given our kind of political culture and how divisive things are set up and so forth. But then it's important to kind of work through that. To what extent is it possible to have these two sources both reliable? So what I've done is they identify these sources, they rate them as reliable or not reliable. And then we do this kind of four corners strategy, might be familiar to some of you, where I ask them to stand in the corner of the room based on their rating of the source. So, they look at the Heartland's site, which is the NIPCC source. And if they designated most reliable, or highly reliable or somewhat reliable, somewhat unreliable to unreliable, each of those is a quadrant in the room. So they'll go stand there. And then the activity is just for students to say, okay, make a case for why you think that particular source is reliable or not. And they have an opportunity in that discussion to convince each other of their view. And if their view changes based on the evidence presented and the quality of the discussion, they can then move across the room and occupy a different quadrant. So I think what Don's referring to is an example where there were almost all students in a class of 23 or 24 who were viewing this one source from the NIPCC as reliable, highly reliable, or somewhat reliable. And there was one or two other students who said the source wasn't. And without saying anything from me, without any prompting from the instructor, that one student was able to persuade all of his classmates to come across the room because he was able to discern that that particular source from the Heartland Institute was not reliable. So that's an opportunity to use these kind of eco-civic practices like dialogue and discussion, setting up a classroom where that can happen. Now, if that didn't happen, if there wasn't a student who was able to do that, then I think it's incumbent upon me to ask the kinds of questions to help them get there. So let's go look at this source and let's look at its funding. Let's look at its history. And is it possible that both of these can be reliable at the same time? So in that situation, I didn't need to do that because a student was able to make that claim and convince his other students.
Yeah, and another piece that in that same chapter that I found really interesting was the student who dismissed sites because they were government sites and therefore couldn't be true because the government's not reliable. And I thought that was an interesting approach for a future teacher to dismiss government websites. And
it's important to surface those, right?
Yes.
That's one of the goals of this kind of dialogue, is just to surface all of our beliefs and understandings, and that gets to the ecological philosophy issue too. The more we can reflect on those and have conversations about them, the more we can learn with and from each other. So
Yep, and there's a couple more questions in the chat. How much you frame the inquiry in the context that climate change is real as a lens Is it real as a lens evaluate sources to not end up developing climate deniers? How much? I don't think I read that quite right. How much you frame the inquiry in the context that climate change is real as a lens evaluate sources. I think maybe there's a word missing there, Cindy.
That's a great question. And I think one way, probably the most successful way I've done it is by crafting a really good inquiry question. And the inquiry question that I alluded to earlier that has been the most useful has been the question, again, what best explains why there's this range of beliefs about climate change despite the scientific consensus? So in order to answer that question, there are two core understandings you start from. One is that there is a climate consensus. So I have to show them the data about the climate consensus. So I bring in that research. Okay, this is one of these understandings you need to have in order to answer that question. And the second understanding you need to know is what is the range of beliefs? So that's where I draw from the Yale Climate Change Communication Surveys and say, okay, here's the range of beliefs. Here is the scientific consensus. Now you need to figure out what best explains why this is the case. So again, this is where they think is a historical explanation. There's an economic explanation. There's a social explanation, the psychological, and so forth, and geographic. And in some situations, I give them some texts that offer those explanations, that give them some of the evidence that they can then evaluate. Sometimes I say you have to go find that evidence on your own. If they're struggling to do that, and many of them do struggle, I'll have a bank of those sources with me to say, okay, here's a historical explanation for why to answer that question. Evaluate, is that a reasonable explanation? Here's an economic explanation and so forth. And I wrote a chapter about a book that's not really this, I don't think this is in this book as much. We do address that question in the book, but there's a separate article where I dive deeply into those sources and how to structure an inquiry. If you're interested, I've been happy to get that source to you.
Yeah, and I'll note, I think it's really interesting that question would be appropriate to spend a fair amount of time on in an English classroom, a social studies classroom, or a science classroom, at least.
I do start with the science. So in answer to whenever situation, I try to do it in the framework of a question that they're answering. There tends to be less pushback. Sometimes there's a little bit pushback with students, but for the most part.
Okay. Are there other questions? I think we can stick around for a little bit yet, but we said somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes for tonight. And I will remind you that we do have another session on, or WSKG has a session with some of us on that on Thursday night, which is on one of the solutions on how we can stop burning stuff to heat our buildings. And I think it's a really exciting project to potentially take 40% of Cornell University's emissions away by heating with deep geothermal heat. So that is in that Google Doc I shared. And maybe we'll see some of you on Thursday, but like I said, we can stick around for a few more questions if folks have them. Feel free. Folks have to run. Great to see you, Alex. And looks like we're wrapping up. So thank you very much, James. It was a great session and great to see you again.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity. And thanks again, everyone, for attending this evening.
And I will add the link to the YouTube recording to that document probably tomorrow. Thank you, one and all. Have a great night.
Have a great evening.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.